Hello, good afternoon. It's 2 minutes past the hour. People are still filtering in, but we're going to get started. Welcome to this wonderful pre-Thanksgiving webinar brought to you by your friends at Vicente LLP, bringing your brand to New York. So next slide, please. Vicente is the premier cannabis and psychedelics law firm. Founded in Denver in 2010, we opened our New York office in 2019. We've worked with many dozens of license applicants. We work with adult use licenses, registered organizations, and also many of the early hemp cultivators and processors who have switched over to cannabis. I'll note that we are in, I forget how many states now. It looks like a lot of states. And also we have a pretty thriving hemp practice, including some excellent state-by-state guides. And these are used by some of the biggest retailers in the country. So please reach out to us whenever we can be helpful. So introducing our panel today, I'm Jennifer Cabrera. I've been with the firm since 2019. Prior to that, I was a commercial disputes attorney. I am joined by my wonderful colleague, Sahar Ayanasazian, who is in our LA office, but with whom I've worked on a number of New York deals over the last year. She's worked with some of the biggest companies in cannabis, and I have to say is a really wonderful, brilliant, creative attorney. Sahar, please.
Thanks, Jen. That's a hard intro to follow up with. As Jen mentioned, I'm one of the partners in the LA office. My specialties are corporate transactions, which are what's allowed me to be able to provide services to clients really throughout the country. And I also chair the firm's banking group. So really anything that has to do with starting a company, growing the company, financing, M&A, licensing deals, and then all financial institution related needs kind of fall under my umbrella.
Thank you. Next, we have Jess Foyer, who has a she's with Eaton Botanicals and a really impressive PR background, including working with some of the biggest names in media and fashion. Jess, please.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. As Jen mentioned, my name's Jess. I come from a fashion background, but I have been in cannabis now for 4.5 years. So everyone knows that means like what, 40 years, as it does put some years on us. I recently came over to Eaton Botanicals to lead their marketing. We are a functional wellness edible brand here in New York. And prior to that, I worked for one of the registered operators here in New York, Eaton. I know it's a very similar name. I just mixed up some letters and came over here. And I worked directly with the founders, the women of the Peckham family, and just really kind of jumped in headfirst into all things marketing, branding, stores, as we were really transitioning to really make sure that we were continuing to support the medical patients, but also getting ready for adult use.
Well, thank you for being here, Jess. Lastly, we have Gabe Parton-Lee, General Counsel at Wyld. And I'm sure most of you know, Wyld is a West Coast-based brand that has really grown across the country in the past few years. And I think one of the most striking features of this brand is its beautiful, elegant packaging. It's aimed clearly at adults, and it really looks like something you would get as like a bridal party gift. So it's really great to have you here, Gabe.
Thank you, and I'm happy to be here. As you introduced, I'm Gabe Parton-Lee, the General Counsel for Wyld. I've been with Wyld now for about 6.5 years, and the company's been around for about 8 years, and we're in 17 states, and they're finishing an acquisition up in Canada right now, and we're so excited for the New York market to continue to blossom. I mean, we've just gotten our processing license out there and are waiting in the queue for our add-on distribution, and just excited to make New York one of our backyards. While we are in a bunch of states. We try to treat each state differently and uniquely, because they're, we have to build our own community. We have to build everything out there in every single state. And so New York is, has been something that we've been looking forward to for quite a long time. So excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, so following on what Gabe said, New York's an exciting market, right? It's probably the biggest cannabis market in the world, just in terms of number of consumers, amount of money that is spent on it. And this goes back many, many years to a thriving illicit market. But the road to an adult use cannabis market has been a slow and bumpy one. While the state opted in for medical marijuana, the program started in 2016, the former governor was not a big fan of cannabis at all. And so it really was very small. There were a limited number of conditions that allowed you to become a patient, and there just weren't a lot in terms of sales. Adult use legalization really started in 2021 with the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. And then the following summer, August of 22, we start having the card program. These were retail licenses that were available only to people with past New York cannabis convictions. So a relatively small program, but the opening shot in the OCM, the Office of Cannabis Management's legalization process. They wanted to prioritize people who were coming over whose lives had been destroyed by criminalization, number one, and also bringing over the illicit market. The process of closing down the illicit market and opening the adult use one has been a rocky one, but we're seeing progress. The first legal regulated store opened right before, in late December 2022, Housing Works, with a number of stores following soon thereafter. The first packaging, labeling, marketing regulations became effective in March of 2023. Those will come up a few times during this presentation. Those are currently the subject of revision. Public comment recently closed on them. Now we have many stores open in the state. Next slide, please. It's a big state. We've got over 19 million people in New York. 2023 revenue, which was the first full year of adult use sales, was over 160 million. 2024, obviously much higher because we have many more stores open. So in October, it exceeded 530 million, and we're see a continuing upward tick. Part of this also is as illegal stores shut down. So here we are in this exciting market. You have a brand and you'd like to bring it to New York. We consider it the center of the world here. I understand other places don't necessarily agree with that, but here we are. So how do you go about doing this? And I turn it over to you, Sahar.
Jen, as an Angelino, I do have to fight you back a little bit on New York being the center of the world. But I will say, first, reflecting on what you had mentioned about New York's rollout, it's indicative and reflects the rollout of other large states like California, with the caveat that I think New York is doing it probably the most successfully, quickly, and efficiently. So even though it may feel slow at times, in the grand scheme of things, they're doing wonderfully. So having said that, and recognizing New York for just how wonderful it is overall for its cannabis market, of course, everyone wants to come in here. What are your options for coming in as a brand? The way that we've seen it break out has really been largely into two different categories, which is asset light and asset heavy. So with asset heavy, as its name goes, you have more that you're bringing into the market. You're bringing in your name, you're bringing in your standard operating procedures, how things are done, how they're made, how they're packaged, and everything in between. You'll also likely be bringing in equipment that you'll be leasing to the manufacturer who's going to be making your product. Part and parcel with equipment often is staff that goes along with the equipment, works the equipment, has the knowledge and the know-how to really use it and work with the manufacturer to do so. You also have additional intellectual property that might come. So that might mean things like your branding, your trademarks, your trade secrets, They kind of tend to work part and parcel with your standard operating procedures, but that's what really makes your brand yours and really well known. And then also one of the intellectual property pieces that you bring in is your know-how. So everything that is kind of protectable under trade secrets, things like that. On the other side of the spectrum is more of the asset light model, which, as its name suggests, is a bit lighter. It largely has your name and maybe your standard operating procedures, but unlike the asset heavy model, you as the brand would not be as heavily involved in the process of the manufacturing and the packaging, everything else with respect to the products that are being produced under your brand. Next slide, please. Okay, so the state of New York also has its own specifics when it comes to branding as far as licensing goes. Your first option is applying for a processor type 1 or type 2 license, which really those two licenses would allow for what we traditionally tend to think of as cannabis activities. So acquisition, possession, extraction, blending, infusion, packaging, all that good stuff that we traditionally tend to think of as manufacturing. It should be noted that at this time, applications for types 1 and 2 are not currently open. So something to think about if that is a strategy that you're thinking of going with. There are, however, about 279 conditional adult use cultivators and 40 conditional adult use processors licensed in New York State currently. So you do have the option of working with them. You just don't currently have the option of having those licenses or getting those licenses for yourself. Additionally, it should be noted that there are 539 applicants that have applied for a type 1 or type 2 processor license during the 2023 application period. So it is a sought after license, and this would be a strategy that certain folks are thinking about when bringing their brand to market in New York. The other option in terms of licensing in the state of New York for bringing your brand is to contract with a New York processor to make the products for you. For those who have been in other states before, this is something that will seem pretty familiar to them. An intellectual property licensing, a manufacturing agreement, something between those two. So this, of course, would entail entering into your branding or white labeling agreement with a licensed processor, which in the state of New York would often make you, or almost always make you, a true party of interest of that processor, as that term is defined in the regulations. You can also obtain a processor type 3 license, allowing you to enter into white label agreements with other processors without becoming a true party of interest. It should be noted, however, that those types of licenses, type 3, are currently open. So that's a possibility for a more current option. Next slide, please. Jen, I'm gonna bring you in on this one as well, given your regulatory expertise in New York.
Yeah, of course. So the type 3 license that is currently available, there's definitely a lot of interest because it's the only license you can apply for in New York at the moment. There are two distinct kinds. One, the type 3 flower license. This is only available to current holders of an adult use cannabis cultivator license. So Eaton Botanicals. If you have a cannabis cultivator license, you can make your own branded products or another brand's products. This is only going to be cannabis flower pre-rolls. That's it. If you are looking to have your brand that you've developed be made by another business, then you're looking at the type 3 branding license. And that is a traditional white labeling agreement. It is a non-plant touching license. So in contrast to type 3 flower, which is held by the license that actually is flower touching, a type 3 branding license is held by the people that own the intellectual property, and they're not allowed to do any plant touching activity whatsoever. They don't even need a licensed premises in the state. It is simply a way of being categorized by the OCM. So that's my explanation, Zahar.
So Jen, essentially, if I'm a brand and I want to come into New York and operate as just a brand, and I want to work under a license, my only option really is the type 3 branding license. Is that correct?
Right.
Summarize?
Yes. The alternative would have been if you had applied for a type 1 or type 2 processor license last year when it was available. And that would allow you then to have your own in-state presence. If you haven't done that already and you're not acquiring one of those licenses, your only option right now is type 3 branding.
Excellent. Next slide, please. So to kind of summarize the branding options that we've been going over, some of the considerations as a brand to think about when choosing the asset light or asset heavy approach and exactly how that works for your business are, first and foremost, control. How much control do you want to exert over the manufacturing of your product? And part and parcel with that, how much control is permissible under the regulations and also in light of the model that you're seeking to implement? Because at the crux, obviously, of every relationship in cannabis is regulations and what's regulatorily permitted. After that is also thinking about expense. Just how much do you want to expend into bringing your brand into New York, and how much is possible for you to expend first and foremost, and then as time continues to go on? Because of course, the more assets that you're trying to bring in, the more of an expense, at least at the start, you're going to be looking at. Additionally, you'll want to think about the state disclosure requirements. What do you have to tell the state? And also, what are you comfortable telling the state? How are you comfortable being listed? And that also obviously feeds into the control section of it. You'll also want to think about profit sharing. So we'll see across the country, really, intellectual property agreements having either a profit sharing model, so a percentage of the revenue coming in from the product, versus a more flat fee model. The considerations for that are both, of course, economical between the two parties, as well as what is permitted by the state's own regulations. But you'll want to think about how much of the profits you're looking to get back, and of course, what the relationship between you and the manufacturer dictates. But that also will feed into the state disclosure requirements and the control, because of course, the revenues that you receive from another licensee's business will also define how much control you have, or the true party of interest pieces in there. So something to think about both from your own economic model as well as your regulatory thoughts. And then, of course, when it comes to your brand, it's your brand ethos. What is your brand's identity? If you've been in other states before, traditionally, what has your brand's identity been, and how do you want to either express that, continue that, evolve that, or maybe change that in the New York market? And what does that brand ethos require? Does it require additional control? Does it require more assets? Is it something that you can have with a asset lighter model? And then, of course, there is your product type. And so making sure that the product type that you have can be done under the model that you choose. If your product type is incredibly specialized, requires very special machinery, has to be packaged in a very certain kind of way, and only a few people understand how to work those machines, the choice is kind of made for you. Whereas if you have, say, a run-of-the-mill edible that can be made by pretty easily by following a recipe and doesn't require a super specialized equipment or super specialized folks to make it and package it, then maybe the asset light model may be something that you'll want to consider. And so, of course, now I want to kick it to our two real brand experts on this panel, Jess and Gabe to kind of walk us through how some of these considerations feed into their strategies for New York and how it may have worked for them and how they may have also recognized that they need to kind of change things up a little bit.
You first, Jess.
Do we want to talk about the pack? Oh, not yet. Okay, hold on. We're going back.
Yeah, we're in considerations when choosing asset heavy versus asset light. So
Yeah, so I mean, for Eaton specifically, we have a cultivation license. It's a type 4 license, and there's different tiers that the reason it's that is just based on the number of canopy space, how many square feet we can actually cultivate on. We do everything outdoors, and we were actually one of those first licenses that they granted in the state. So I think I would call it almost like between asset light. We're going to call it asset medium. Just because, you know, when we're having our own cultivation, obviously we do have the control over it, but we also have the expenses. We also have really everything that you're seeing kind of on this slide here, but we also then have all of that control from the brand ethos, from the product type. But we are really taking our finished flower product, and because we don't have a processor license, we are then sending it to one processor that's making the gummies and one processor that's making our pre-rolls. So we are really just focused on producing that really high quality flower and then giving those inputs to our processors. So we really still control, you know, what our packaging looks like, all of those ingredients that go into all of our products. We're really just giving them everything and they are physically putting it together because we don't have that type of license right now. So that's kind of like, I'd say a long and short of what kind of our current state kind of looks like. And then I think Gabe can speak to, you know, what they do because they're obviously coming from another state. So it's a little bit different.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. And I like that asset medium, the kind of in between of bringing your brand in and then also maintaining some degree of control. And I think that, you know, one of the major pieces that that's involved in that sort of decision making is, you know, the quality and care that you expect out of the product. I mean, with an asset light model, you're going to, you know, take a little bit less control. You're not going to have, you know, the direct oversight over the folks that are actually putting product in package, and you're going to have a little bit less oversight over, you know, the how sales are run, and, you know, just generally how to bring your brand to market. The asset heavy side, the asset medium side, you get a little bit more control, and, you know, if you want the consistency and quality that you've built over some time, you want to make sure that you maintain that. I mean, that's what separates brands from, you know, from simple products. And this is, you know, Eaton, off hours, you know, the folks in New York that have, created incredible brands. They've maintained the control that they have over these products, and, you know, it's similar to our expansion model as well, is that we want to maintain the most control that we have, which is why we went for the license ourselves. And, you know, in working before we were licensed in our own right, we worked closely with with a processor, a conditional use processor that's out there. And, we feel that we were able to work closely, or find a good partner, work closely with them, understand exactly what our intention was behind the brand, and bring it to market in a way that we enjoyed. And, you know, as part of the disclosure issues, we want to make sure, you know, you do want to make sure that you're paying attention, because this is a highly regulated market and people care. And you want to make sure that, you know, you're approaching it in a way that doesn't negatively affect you in the future. And so being upfront, being clear, knowing the disclosure requirements, knowing what contracts, you know, require disclosure, it's incredibly important to ensure that you're playing by the rules, because ultimately this is a highly regulated market that you have to abide by. So, you know, generally we take the asset heavier approach, where we want to have the same control that we've been able to show success with in the states that we've been in, and New York is no different in that sense.
Okay. I'm gonna just jump in and answer a few of the questions that we have in the chat that are relevant to what we've been talking about. So, going through these just to relevant to this discussion. So how much control can a brand have over the making of their product by a manufacturer? So just high level, there are two ways that you can have a white labeling agreement with a processor. You can either be a TPI of that processor, or you can have your own license. So if you're a cultivator, you could enter into a white labeling agreement with a processor. If you're not that, then in theory, you have to have a license that lets you do business with the processor. That's why the OCM created this type 3 license. And if you fall into one of these categories, you have your own license or you are a TPI of the processor, you can have pretty much all the control you need. You can hire personnel, like there are going to be restrictions on undue influence, but as long as it's disclosed to the OCM and you're already a TPI, then there's not a restriction on how much revenue you could take, for instance. And that goes to a couple of these other questions, like what's the benefit of getting a type 3 processor license as opposed to being a TPI? Well, if you're a TPI, you're going through full disclosure, right? So if you don't want every owner of your company going up to the human that actually owns it, and you're not a passive investor, you're going to have to go through some pretty burdensome disclosure requirements. And is there a third way to come into the state via a goods and services agreement? And the answer is you can have a goods and services agreement, but that won't get you to white labeling. That's not a third way. If you want to do white labeling, then you need to do it by having your own license or by being a TPI. So, oh, and then whether or not a processor can get into a consulting agreement with another processor. Yes, two licensees can work together on this. Sahar, before we change over, any final thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I think what our two panelists have mentioned about what works for their business, especially in light of, New York brand versus a brand that has been expanding throughout the country, is really, really key to think about and really highlight some of the things that folks should be thinking about that perhaps may not come to the forefront of one's mind. I think for me, the way to summarize it is, before bringing the brand in to New York, it's really important to have a very holistic view of exactly what you want both the current state to look like, as well as what you want the future of your brand to look like. And all of that has to be put into consideration with the regulations, with what your brand looks like, with what both your comfort level, as well as if you have investors, the comfort level of your investors are for being listed on a license and gone through, like you mentioned, Jen, the background check all the way up to the human level. So it's a really full spectrum consideration.
Awesome. So what does it look like to advertise in New York? What can your brand look like? What can your logo look like? What can your packaging look like? Let's get into it. So we currently have packaging and labeling rules that go back a little over a year at this point, and they're being revised. There was a lot of pushback against how far reaching some of those rules were. The OCM heard our complaints and they revised it. So it's pretty exciting to see that kind of regulator response. So in New York, exit packaging is permitted, but it's not required. This is part of a sustainability and environmental focus that you really see throughout the regulations and throughout the program that we're going to hear come up actually a couple times in here. I'm not going to read through the requirements. Obviously, packaging must be child resistant, and it has to also remain child resistant, like after it's been opened, so that it can be resealed and still be hard to open for kids. And you also have to obviously be opaque to protect it from contaminants. There are a number of restrictions. So for instance, cannabis products and advertising can't be attractive to minors. That is a blanket rule in the regulations. What does that mean? There are a few examples given. Cartoons are not allowed. Similarity to words or products that are commonly associated with kids, like Captain Crunch cereal, Snickers bar. You're trying to avoid any confusion or something that looks like it's going to be a product for kids. Some variation on candy or candies in the store and in the product's name, regardless of spelling. There are a few items on this list, including bubble type or cartoon-like font, bright neon colors. Those are actually not in the regulations. Rather, those came in an old guidance document quite a while ago now that is pursuant to the old the currently existing regulations. I don't want to call them old because they're what governs us today. However, the revised regulations remove a lot of the restrictions on bright colors, for instance, or references like there too, that is probably going to result in a new guidance document. And the restriction on bubble letters, graffiti type font, bright neon colors, restrictions on the saturation of colors that are permissible, those will probably go away given how the revised regulations read.
And I do
Next.
want to highlight that everything that we're seeing in New York with respect to packaging, especially not attractive to minors, is very much reminiscent and very much echoes what we've seen throughout the rest of the country. So putting that into the perspective of bringing your brand to New York, if you're a brand that's been in other states before, this is something that's actually familiar to you for the most part and shouldn't really be changing too much in how you package your products and in how you advertise your product. So, if you've been doing it right in other states, it actually allows for almost seamless continuity in terms of how you present your brand and package your brand in the state of New York.
That is a great point. We're starting to see that kind of harmonization in branding rules across the country. And it's often when a state comes up with new regulations, there are some rough edges that get sanded off over time. And so I think that there's more of a sense from the regulators that there's a spectrum of what is permissible. And so the inclusion of an animal may in and of itself not be a problem. It matters if it's a talking cartoon shark. All right.
I do want to jump in and address
Yeah.
the the packaging and labeling consistency across the U.S. because this is something that we have to deal with on an everyday basis. Ultimately, places like New York, places like California, places that have an economy that's based around brands, consumer products, and business are have been more friendly. We've seen that, and we've seen a need for attractive brands to bring people into the regulated market. And I think that there's a responsibility that's required on the side of the processors and producers as well, and the brands, because these are adult use products or they're medical products, and they're not. We make a delicious gummy, and we don't want that necessarily to fall into the hands of children. And ultimately, a lot of the marketing branding is intended for adults, and where certain states fall in determining what is attractive to children is it's far between. There's states that prohibit any part of an animal or any sort of flowers or any sort of branding at all. And Canada is as one of them, where they're prohibiting any sort of imagery on any packaging. So there's there is a wide spectrum of what is an acceptable non-attractive to children product. And I'm hopeful that places like New York can establish this sort of leadership status that we need for unifying exactly what a packaging and labeling regulation should look like. And hopefully as things change, we'll be able to see more folks sort of adopt what New York is doing.
Wouldn't that be nice if we could have more states be consistent on packaging and labeling?
That's the dream.
You could use packaging across multiple states. All right. So in terms of branding, you can't use terms like organic. I'm on the, oh, thank you. Terms like organic or craft unless you are meeting the qualifications for that are found in the regulations. So they want to be careful, including gluten-free, vegan, and kosher, using these terms in a vacuum. So it's a tough thing to actually get approved. Obviously, you can't have branding that appeals to children, but again, a lot of this, the restrictions on fonts and colors, that's probably going to go away with the revised regulations, and it'll be more of a holistic approach. And I think a lot of this is New York's experience probably with the legal retailers that have packaging that is very blatantly attractive to children. You'll have neon green weed in the store window. Like I don't know what sensible person thinks that's a good idea. And I think that you're getting this pushback from OCM to make clear what is an adult use market product versus what is untested and unsafe from another store that's not licensed. One of the biggest changes to the regulations is that now we can have a lot more advertising by licenses, including billboards. So billboards are pretty restricted in what they can include. For instance, you're limited to your entity name or DBA, address, contact information, and a logo. But it's also restricted where they can be. So for instance, you can't be within 500 feet of a school playground or place of worship or public park. So you will be sometime when these new regulations are adopted, if they are adopted as is, you'll have this opportunity to have outdoor signage that's not physically connected to your space. So we're seeing this big change in the proposed regulation. Jess, on the ground, how are people reacting to these changes?
Well, they're already doing it. So they're reacting well and starting already. So I have definitely seen outside the city a fair amount of these billboards that comply with everything you see on the slide, but they're already, I think there's kind of a section upstate that has a few dispensaries, and I think they probably saw one doing that, and then they're all doing it. So, and for me, as a marketing person, I was like super stoked to see it, because when I was driving, I was like, oh my gosh, look. And then I also got my first piece of direct mail. So, I think it's one of those things where as a marketing person, it's always like, even before we knew these changes were coming, it's always this like super gray area of like, what can we do to make sure that we're still able to talk about our, brand or our store to get people in the door, but also not get our license taken away because we kind of took it too far. So I think them not only proposing that there's changes, but also taking the suggestions of all the people that took the time to go back with comments. I think we've seen in prior rounds for different sections, maybe people's comments weren't kind of taken as much. So I think, the industry here is pretty excited that these things are going to loosen up, especially for things like a billboard that you're seeing them for some other things that I maybe wouldn't necessarily want a kid to see. And I think already seeing these things happening is exciting. And it's just going to make, I think, especially outside of New York City, like in places where people drive, this is the kind of things you have to be able to do to bring people to your business and make it thrive. So I'm pretty excited for these changes. And I mean, if people are already doing it, you do you.
It's true. One thing about New York's regulations, they've been pretty wide ranging, right? But enforcement has not always been there. Which makes sense because a lot of the enforcement right now is going toward the illicit stores. Another big change in the revised regulations relates to discounts and in-store promotions. And this is huge because that was a blanket restriction in the current regulations, and it looks like it's going to be going away. You could, before you pretty much couldn't give away any cannabis merch. You could sell it and you were restricted which merch you could sell. So this pertains obviously to stores giving away products, obviously not cannabis products. We're talking about merch at this point, but also outside brands being able to advertise at a store. So under the regulations, there is a $200 limit on how much a brand can spend on advertising brand advertising at a retail store. That's $200 per year per license, which basically means you can't give much away. And it's looking at how much you spent for it. So there's no markup in it. It's not including your cost of transport, but still $200. Like my 11-year-old has more money than that. So anyway, now we are seeing in revised adult use regulations an exception for branded cannabis merchandise that's part of an environmental sustainability program. So, Jess, you're in marketing. I mean, obviously, this has got to be an exciting possibility that's opening up.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like coming from a medical brand, because we could do all of these things. So, especially for medical patients, like you need to be able to offer things like discounts and loyalty. And I think this is kind of another one where I'm already seeing a lot of the dispensaries getting their loyalty programs kind of started, because it's a big lift to do that. It's expensive to do that. So even just things like making sure that they're collecting emails and all of that. I honestly like wasn't too mad at the $200 thing, only because I think it gives a much more level playing field to New York brands to be able to compete with the out of state brands that are coming in, that are going to have, you know, these really fancy displays, and they're going to take up a huge corner of the store, whereas a smaller New York brand might not be able to have all of that fanfare and doesn't get to really have that kind of opportunity to stand out on the shelf. So I think it, you know, hopefully keeps things in moderation, but it also depends on the setup of the dispensary itself and how much they want those type of, you know, larger kind of sections for specific brands, et cetera. It really depends on what the brands are giving and how much space the store is giving them. I think the merch thing is great. I just love merch in general. And especially in New York, I mean, one of the best billboards you can have is somebody wearing your product around and someone's asking them about it, carrying your tote bag. So that I think is really great. And also, people love like a gift with purchase and things like that. So being able to just like start to be able to do those type of honestly more creative things in marketing, where it's not just so black and white, I think it's just going to make a lot more opportunities for brands to be able to just show what they're all about and show their differentiation.
I mean, I think it's important. I know I keep coming back to this point to recognize that some of what we're seeing in New York, as far as discounts and store promotions, merch and things like that, are not super specific to New York. We've seen these in other states as well, especially when the regulations are younger and newer. And we've also seen those states be responsive to the industry's needs and to feedback from the industry as well. So I would say that what we're seeing right now, of course, has to be complied with, but based on what we've seen in other states in the past, it may also evolve, I think, as the industry continues to work with the regulators, provide them feedback, and the regulators understand, hey, this is not perhaps as conducive as we thought it would be to ensuring that our licensed players are able to have every chance that they need to continue thriving.
Yeah, I think I think Jess and Sahar, you both hit on the balance that's needed to be struck between, between the industry and between the regulators. Ultimately, this is a partnership between the regulated folks and the regulators in building a new economy in New York. And we love we love an advertisement. We love working with our partners to find the right thing. But ultimately, a level playing field excites us. We love the competition and love the opportunity to, to let the product speak for itself. And I think that that's what's seen a lot of success in the markets that we've been in, and ultimately, the the state of New York has done a really good job of trying to put everything on paper and implementing it in the best way possible. And I think that they approach it with the best intentions possible, which is really exciting. I mean, I love that they're setting up a fully comprehensive program. But just like everything, as this industry evolves, it's a constant conversation in between and balance between the regulators and the regulated parties, and finding a way to actually make this market attractive and available for consumers and patients in New York.
So it's good to see positive change in New York regulations, and I think it's really great to offer the exception to the price limit that you can spend on brand advertising if it's part of an environmental sustainability program. So reusable products are really going to be prioritized in this way. So pretty exciting changes that we see coming. All right. Just really quickly, I'm going to hit on cannabinoid hemp market in New York. So obviously, it's just not as big as it is in some other states, and that's mostly because New York has an adult use cannabis market. So you can buy products at a store, you order them for delivery, so you're less likely to buy an intoxicating hemp product. Also, New York has pretty strict rules on what is hemp versus what is cannabis. Obviously, it's the same plant, but if it is a product with over 0.3% delta 9 THC, that is going to be in the cannabis market. It's not going to be something that can be sold by simply a hemp retailer. And also in New York, if you want to sell any kind of intoxicating or non-intoxicating cannabinoid hemp products, you need a hemp retailer license. Now, dispensaries can have this license, which allows them to sell these products, but like if you're a bodega selling this, you're supposed to have a cannabinoid hemp retailer license. So, Wyld, you're selling some non-intoxicating products in store and online, right?
Correct.
And how do those do? Like in store, is there much of a market for it among adult use consumers?
In New York, no. We still have our Wyld CBD line in some New York dispensaries, and they've been there for some time now. But the main consumer in any adult use market is going to be adult use product. It's intoxicating products that people are interested in, which is why there is such a concern about intoxicating hemp cannabinoid products, is that it threatens the the existing regulated market, and the difference in regulatory oversight there is distinct. For in balancing between a non-intoxicating sort of wellness product and a supplement versus versus an intoxicating product, I mean, I think that the adult use market is intended for intoxicating products, and so naturally customers are going to stray towards those products. And we live in the 21st century. Folks are ordering things online, and we're seeing a lot more online orders than we are in-store orders. And it's great to have that direct contact with customers, but it's there's an advertising and marketing perspective of it that that allows people to see your brand across multiple different mediums. That's really exciting. But in terms of the true return on investment of trying to build a non-intoxicating hemp brand in New York through the intoxicating cannabis marketplace, it's difficult.
Yeah, it's definitely true. You don't see it as much in the illegal state. Jess, so Eaton Botanicals has stayed away pretty much from intoxicating hemp products, right?
Yes, that is not our jam and won't be our jam, but we love hemp. The brand actually started, we were the first farm to actually plant the first hemp plant in New York when those regulations came through. So we love hemp. The brand started with hemp snack products and actually has an entire other division that is a hemp-based pet bedding. Fun fact that our founder says that I'm going to steal because I love it. Who knew that the third most popular pet is a chicken and they like really fancy bedding? So I think to me, like what's exciting about all of hemp is all of the other things that you can do with it. I think the intoxicating hemp is just like really confused customers, friends, family. I feel like I spend so much time explaining to people, what is what, but we also, for our products, love CBD in general. We have 2 of our 4 gummy SKUs that have the CBD ratio because, especially coming from a medical brand, CBD and THC together are besties and they perform best when together. So I think for us as a brand, we're big believers in the 2 being together and really complementing each other as it relates to the THC products. There is a lot of, fans of that kind of like really balanced ratio. So I think for us as a brand, like we look at it from that side, but not, just having it on its own kind of intoxicating hemp side.
Love to see also that your company, it was the first operational hemp farmer in the state. Is that right?
Well before me, so they get all the props. But yeah, so couldn't have gotten where they are today without kind of starting there. And I think they're like very proud of those roots. So making sure that we really tell that, as again, part of that brand story.
Awesome. So next slide, really just going to skip over this actually, and the slides will be available after the presentation. They'll be emailed to you. So I'm going to skip forward to the unique features of the New York market. So unique. All right, first off, the no payer list. So if you are a supplier, a distributor, or a processor, cultivator, working with a retailer, and that retailer purchased on credit and has not paid in full within 30 days, you're going to be reported. The retailer is going to be reported to the OCM. The suppliers are required by the regulations to report it to the OCM within 7 days of the final payment due date. And that list is maintained and is available to all suppliers in the state. And Jess tells me this is a very useful feature.
I mean, unfortunately, right? We don't want to look on that and see any of our, dispensary friends on there. But I think at the same time, especially for us specifically as a smaller brand, we need people to make the payments so we can keep making more products and get them into the dispensaries. So I think you have to have the checks and balances. And it's one of the, I'd say, more effective kind of tools that they very quickly got up and running. And, it's a list that people don't want to be on. So I think it really holds people accountable to make sure that they are paying on time, because other industries aren't letting that happen. So why would we let that happen? So I think just making sure like the checks and balances of it is definitely something that we check. And just kind of holding people really accountable it's definitely a place that we reference prior to working with retailers.
I mean, just having seen another large market from its infancy, I've been in the California market since 2016 until now. A list like this, in my opinion, is just as important to the health of the regulated market as is enforcement actions and going down and shutting down unlicensed operators, because this tool really does allow for the good actors to be able to work with others who are going to feed into their success and is going to make being in the licensed market lucrative and continuously lucrative, rather than forcing folks to think about other options. So while this may seem a little bit harsh at first blush, it really is such an important aspect of the continued health of licensed actors in the market.
I agree with all those points. I mean, I think, initially I am not I don't truly appreciate any sort of regulatory body getting in the way between business relationships. I think that there's the system of credit has existed since people were carving it into stone tablets. But but I do like the idea that there's different ways to hold people accountable, because we don't know, not everybody has the stable banking, not everybody has the stable financing because of the industry that we're operating in, and so it's hard to it is hard to balance, ensuring that your AR is appropriate. And for all brands, it's necessary to ensure that you're able to get the receivables that you've earned, and are capable of employing that cash, because otherwise you're just providing a no fee loan to an operator out there. So, ultimately, I this does strike a balance between forcing everybody to pay on COD, like a Washington, but then preventing the issues that are currently happening in California and other markets, where folks are just going under and getting and screwing over creditors that have been selling product to them, and they've benefited from it. So I think there's a balance. I'm interested to see how this plays out over the next couple of years, as this grows, because we haven't participated in a market that's had this sort of the COD list, but it'd be interesting to see how many people end up on it in the next year.
Hopefully not too many. Last but not least, the most unique feature, not exactly, of the New York market is its sizable illicit market. It is something that truly did grow in the years between decriminalization and the thriving of the legal licensed market. And this has happened in many different places. It hit New York particularly badly, partly because there's a strong small business culture, particularly in its cities, and also because it took a while for licenses to be awarded. And the longer it takes to get stores open, the more the illicit market moves in. But we have seen a really effective crackdown on this in the last year. I know that there have been a lot of news stories, even recently, about over 2,000 illicit stores in New York City alone. And I think a lot of these numbers at this point are outdated, because anecdotally, and having talked with the panelists before this presentation started, the number of illicit stores you walk by just walking through Manhattan, also Brooklyn, has gone down. Is that everyone's impression?
Yes, thankfully. I mean, I think there was a lot of silver linings to it, most importantly, not selling to children. But even just seeing, dispensary partners and the uptick that they saw like almost immediately when these stores started shutting down near them, especially where they were like hyper saturated, like in the Lower East Side and certain parts of Brooklyn, it was really hurting those stores. So to be able to see that the enforcement happened, I'm going to say quick-ish, and that it was able to make those differences was great. And I think it's just going to keep out those bad actors, so we can just encourage people to go shop at these legal stores, and really make the market here.
Awesome. And if we could go to the last slide with everyone's contact info, because we are at time. I wasn't able to get through all of the questions. There was a pretty lively Q&A going on. I did just want to note, because I said I would answer it, that New York does have rules for cannabis consumption lounges. There just aren't any being allowed right now. So the regulations exist. It's just a matter of the OCM being ready with either licensing, a licensing process for it, or some sort of regulatory approval process for each of those. Other friends of the firm that I see in the chat, just reach out to me. Happy to answer your questions. In particular, Elliot Choi, you know where to reach me. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And I wish you all very happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.